The following podcast is based on publicly available documents and reporting. All facts presented are drawn from verified sources. Certain scenes are dramatized or reconstructed for clarity and storytelling purposes. All individuals are presumed innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. Listener discretion is advised. Our story begins in Texas County, Oklahoma, where the population is just under 20,000. A place where the plains stretch forever, and everyone knows your name, or at least thinks they do. It's the kind of place people drive through on their way to somewhere else. But in April 2024, this quiet, forgotten part of America became the center of something horrific. 2 women vanished. 2 young women, 19-year-old Verlyn Vasquez and 20-year-old Janae Strobel, last seen breathing in a Kansas town so small it barely registers on most maps. What began as worried families filing reports would tear open something much more sinister. Missing persons became murder. Simple disappearance became a window into extremist cells, twisted faith, and the quiet radicalization festering in forgotten corners of rural America. This isn't just a story of 2 women who should have made it home. This is about the poison running through the veins of some American communities. The violence that lives in plain sight, dressed up as righteousness. And what happens when ordinary people get caught in its current and dragged under. I'm Dan Cooley, and this is Buried in God's Country. Tuesday afternoon, the call came in about Janae Strobel, 24 hours of radio silence from someone who never went dark. We all have that friend who lives in their own time zone, who treats communication like a casual suggestion. Janae was not that person. When Janae went quiet, people noticed. Miles away, another phone kept ringing unanswered. Verlyn Vasquez's friend dialing the same number, getting the same hollow void. No response, no explanation. Just the kind of silence that makes your skin crawl. The last time they were seen was Monday evening, alive and laughing. Now Tuesday was bleeding into Wednesday, and 2 women had simply vanished.
Yeah, I'm Verlyn's cousin. Verlyn. She did text me that morning. It was like a funny meme, and we do that sometimes. Like, we text each other that type of stuff, which that wasn't unusual, you know. I texted her back, and I didn't really hear anything from her, and then a few hours went by, and I called her, and it just went to voicemail, and I didn't leave her a voicemail because we don't really do that, but I just didn't really hear. I didn't hear from her from after that, you know. So it's like she just disappeared. Disappeared into thin air.
That meme was Verlyn's final digital footprint before vanishing into silence. By Wednesday, the paperwork was filed. 2 missing persons reports. But Texas County operates on a different clock, where vast stretches of empty land breed a certain patience. A quiet faith that people always find their way home. Out here, waiting is practically a religion. This time, faith would be shattered. They weren't coming back. By week's end, 2 names surfaced from the whispers and worry. David Hoovey Jr. and Tiffany Adams. Around here, everyone knew the Hooveys, the kind of family that lived by their own rules, miles from anyone who might question them. Self-sufficient, they called it. Paranoid, others whispered. Some neighbors used polite words like survivalists. Others cut straight to the bone. Dangerous. When the badges showed up asking questions, the stories began to crack. Details that didn't line up, eyes that wouldn't meet, the kind of nervous energy that makes investigators lean forward. Suspicion hardened into certainty. Time for a search warrant. Inside the house, investigators found their worst fears confirmed. Blood painted across surfaces, furniture overturned. The unmistakable signature of violence. A trail led them deeper into the property, toward answers nobody wanted to find. April 18th, 2 bodies discovered. Verlin, Janae. The authorities haven't released all the details. Some horrors are too precise for public consumption, but the truth cuts through the silence like a blade. Murder, calculated and cold. But this was not random violence or a crime of passion. The people who killed them weren't just broken, they were believers, convinced they were instruments of something sacred, something that demanded blood. They thought God told them to do it.
Yes, we believe the individuals involved may be connected to an anti-government organization. One suspect has made statements aligning with a group known as God's Misfits. God's Misfits, it's an anti-government organization that has been, what we understand is that they believe God dictates their actions. They are the hand of God.
That's what they call themselves. An extremist religious cell that twisted scripture into justification, mixed anti-government rage with divine delusion, and wrapped it all in the kind of control that suffocates souls. Rural extremist groups aren't new. They've been festering in America's forgotten corners for decades, making headlines when the violence finally spills over. But this one stayed hidden. Until now. Texas County sits at Oklahoma's farthest edge, the kind of place where the horizon swallows everything. Flat as a table, dry as a bone, conservative to the core. Out here, there's an unspoken rule that keeps the peace. You mind your business and I'll mind mine. It's not politeness, it's not small-time charm, it's survival. And when everyone's looking the other way, darkness finds plenty of room to grow.
You know, there's a lot of folks out here who don't trust nobody but their kin and maybe the preacher. Government, media, that's the enemy, as far as they're concerned.
This kind of distrust doesn't just appear overnight. It's inherited. Passed down like a family heirloom nobody wants but everybody keeps. Sometimes it stays quiet. Sometimes it rots from the inside out. Enter God's Misfits. A fringe collective of true believers who saw themselves as the chosen ones, beyond human law, above earthly judgment. They weren't your typical organized militia with matching uniforms and weekend drills. They were scattered across the landscape, unpredictable, dangerous in their isolation, but bound together by something darker than geography, ideology. At the center of their twisted faith was a simple, horrifying belief that outsiders, especially women, were objects to be used or eliminated. The word leader doesn't quite capture the madness that was David Hoovey Sr. Once an oil field worker, now a hermit with a God complex. He held court from his living room, but he wasn't preaching scripture. He was rewriting it. Court documents paint the picture. The federal government was Satan's army. Women were born corrupted. The apocalypse was coming, and only his hand-picked faithful would see tomorrow. It wasn't theology. It was delusion with a divine stamp. Verlin and Janae weren't part of his chosen few. They were just in the wrong place when his twisted prophecies demanded blood.
These groups often blend distorted scripture with political paranoia. It creates a kind of spiritual warfare mindset where normal moral boundaries don't apply. That's how you get someone to justify murder in God's name.
What chills the blood isn't just the murders themselves. It's how many red flags were unnoticed or were deliberately ignored. Tiffany Adams, one of the accused, had been lighting up police reports for months. Erratic behavior, threatening neighbors. In one incident, she brandished a weapon during what she called a spiritual purge. The paperwork was filed, the reports were written. No charges came. The system shrugged and moved on, leaving a loaded gun waiting to be triggered. We tracked down someone who worked alongside one of the suspects. She agreed to talk, but only in the shadows. No name.
They always talked in code, say things like, the system's days are numbered. They called women filth magnets. It was just disturbing. I thought at first they were, just venting. I had no idea they were serious.
But their delusions had teeth. Sharp, deadly teeth. This wasn't just basement theology and internet rants. There were weapons stockpiled, homemade traps rigged across the property, an isolated compound they called the Den. Sacred ground in their twisted minds, the place where prophecy met blood. The murders of Verlin and Janae weren't random acts of violence. They were the inevitable explosion of years spent nurturing hate, isolation breeding paranoia, ideology left to fester without challenge. In Texas County, it's not special. It's not unique. Across rural America, there are hundreds of groups just like God's misfits. Same twisted faith, same dangerous delusions, same potential for blood. They just haven't crossed the line. Yet. By mid-April, the hunt had evolved. Police weren't searching for Verlin Vasquez and Janae Strobel anymore. They were tracking the monsters who erased them, and the poisonous faith that told them it was holy work. April 13th, 2024. Search warrant in hand, authorities descend on a patch of Texas County, Oklahoma dirt. Nothing but flat earth stretching to the horizon, dry grass, empty sky, until they found the trail. A blood stain darker than the soil, broken glasses catching sunlight, fragments of a story no one wanted to read. And then, in a trench carved fresh in the Oklahoma earth, 2 bodies. The search was over.
Authorities confirmed the remains belonged to 19-year-old Verlin Vasquez and 20-year-old Janae Strobel, missing for nearly 2 weeks. Both women were murdered. Charges followed quickly after.
By April 14th, 4 people had been arrested. Tiffany Adams, grandmother to Verlin's children. Paul Grice, Adams' boyfriend. Tad Cullum, a rancher and member of their Bible group. Cole Thombley, neighbor and militia enthusiast. And there was one uniting thread. They all called themselves God's misfits. Investigators began stitching together the final days before 2 women disappeared forever. A coordinated plan. A meeting arranged in an empty field, a trench carved into the earth days before it would be filled. The arrest affidavit tells a story in cold, clinical language.
Suspects acquired 5 stun guns, prepaid phones, camouflage netting, and walkie-talkies. A grave was dug 2 days prior to the meeting with the victims.
The implications cut bone deep. This wasn't rage boiling over in a moment of madness. This was calculated, premeditated, almost ceremonial in its precision. And the motive? It wasn't greed. It wasn't revenge or jealousy or any human emotion that makes twisted sense. It was controlled wrapped in righteousness. Ideology demanding sacrifice. Murder disguised as divine will. Paul Grice cracked like thin ice. According to Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation reports, the confession spilled out of him. His role in the murders, his hands in the dirt burying what was left, the first domino to fall.
I participated in the killing and burial of Verlin Vasquez and Janae Strobel. We believed it was necessary to reclaim the children. They were ours by God's right.
That word surfaced again and again. God. In every interview, every confession, every twisted justification. Divine authority invoked like a shield. Scripture bent and broken through the lens of paranoia. Violence wrapped in holy language. Murder disguised as righteousness. These weren't just killers with blood on their hands. They were sovereign citizens, true believers who saw U.S. law as meaningless paper, government as illegitimate theater. The courts? Satan's playground. In their minds, they answered to a higher authority, one that conveniently blessed their darkest impulses.
Groups like this often function like cults. They rely on a shared alternate reality, usually centered on divine entitlement and apocalyptic urgency. You're not just obeying a belief, you're defending a prophecy.
The charges came down like a hammer. First-degree murder, kidnapping, conspiracy to commit murder. All 4 suspects locked away without bond, no bail, no second chances. Tiffany Adams, the woman who had once cradled Marilyn as a child, who had earned a grandmother's trust, now stood accused of orchestrating that same girl's death. The ultimate betrayal wrapped in blood.
These individuals carried out a calculated act of violence, driven by fringe ideology. This was not just a crime. This was a belief system in motion.
And the community? Shattered. Texas County, Oklahoma had weathered storms before. Political fights, family feuds, the usual small-town fractures. But nothing like this. Nothing that cut this deep. The town hall days later overflowed with bodies and rage. Parents clutching their children tighter. Church leaders searching for words that wouldn't come. Some faces twisted with anger, others hollow with fear. A community trying to make sense of the senseless.
We prayed for a different ending. We grieve, but we also ask, how do we not see this coming?
How, indeed. A fringe sect operating in the shadows of everyday life. A twisted doctrine that children could be reclaimed by divine decree. And a handful of believers, utterly convinced their blood-soaked hands were doing God's work. Sacred murder. Holy violence. The most dangerous kind of evil. The kind that prays before it kills. They called themselves God's misfits. Not a church with Sunday services. Not a militia with weekend drills. Something far more dangerous. Something that lived in the spaces between. They gathered in barns and backyards, preaching poison. Government as Satan's army. Divine bloodlines. The holy right to reclaim what belonged to them. And when the courts wouldn't give them what they wanted, they took it by blood. According to court documents, they saw themselves as a God-ordained body. One affidavit cut straight to the bone. U.S. law does not apply to them. Instead, they followed their own twisted gospel. Scripture cherry-picked and warped. Sovereign citizen paranoia. And something far darker lurking underneath. The divine right to own other human beings. Especially women. Control disguised as a commandment.
Groups like this thrive on isolation. They cherry-pick Bible verses, distrust any authority, and believe God has chosen them for something greater. And when people believe they're chosen, that's when they stop listening to laws.
And God's misfits didn't just believe they were chosen. They made it real with blood. So where did this poison take root? Court documents reveal it wasn't some vast conspiracy, just a handful of people. Tiffany Adams, Paul Grice, Tad Cullum, and Cole Twombly, scattered across 15 miles of Oklahoma dirt, bound together by a few deadly beliefs. Government is pure evil. Court rulings mean nothing unless stamped by God himself. Women who leave their partners, especially with children, are shattering divine order. Sound familiar? Because this isn't just backwoods extremism. These ideas echo through mainstream rhetoric. Deep state, natural law, CPS child stealing. The language of grievance, twisted into justification for murder.
This isn't QAnon, but it's QAnon adjacent. It's soaked in paranoia, patriarchy, and spiritual warfare. And when you live in a place where no one pushes back, it escalates.
God's misfits weren't building websites or posting manifestos. They just festered for years in the same forgotten corner of Oklahoma, feeding each other's paranoia until it grew teeth. According to Oklahoma court filings, they kept careful records. Doctrine scrawled in notebooks, journals filled with twisted prophecy, some handwritten, some hastily burned when the heat came. But what investigators salvaged revealed something chilling. They believed God had given them a hit list. People who stood in the way of divine order. Verlin Vasquez and Janae Strobel made the list. Their crime? Verlin had escaped. Janae had helped her. In their warped minds, this wasn't murder. It was divine justice, holy enforcement, God's will written in blood.
They referenced the book of Ezekiel and called the victims unclean women. They claimed the land must be cleansed.
This isn't new territory. The same poisonous phrases that echoed from Waco to Ruby Ridge. From compound fires to the 2019 El Paso massacre. When violence gets baptized in holy language, people die. When murder becomes ministry, blood flows like sacrament. Tiffany Adams was a grandmother who baked cookies. Paul Grice fixed air conditioners for a living. Tad Cullum raised horses on weekends. Cole Thrombley grilled burgers and collected firearms. No white hoods, no fortified compounds, no dramatic manifestos. But they built something far more dangerous, a shared delusion. One so intoxicating, it transformed murder into ministry, killing into obedience.
They didn't look crazy. That's the scariest part. They were just neighbors. You waved at them.
But behind those doors, paranoia was rotting from the inside. And when Veralyn dared to ask for custody of her children, the group declared her guilty of breaking divine law. So they buried her for it. Groups like God's Misfits rarely break into the news cycle. But they're not rare. They're scattered across America like landmines. Some fed by YouTube prophets, some by prepper paranoia, some by political rage twisted into political fury. And every now and then, they stop talking and start killing. Not always with assault rifles and shopping malls. Not always with manifestos and live streams. Sometimes it's just two bodies. A hand-dug trench, a quiet farm where screams don't carry. The kind of violence that stays buried until someone starts digging. As we reconstruct the final day, step by step, hour by hour, minute by minute, how two young women walked into a trap they never saw coming, told through court records, forensic evidence, and the last people who saw them alive. They came to pick up children. That's all they thought they were doing. Veralyn Vasquez and Janae Strobel crossed into Oklahoma expecting a simple custody exchange, a routine handoff. What they didn't know was that their executioners had already carved their graves into the earth. Saturday, March 30th. Veralyn and Janae pulled onto a rural property to meet Tiffany Adams, Veralyn's former mother-in-law, for what should have been a simple custody exchange. Court-supervised, legal, routine. But they weren't meeting at a courthouse or police station, where such things belong. They were meeting on private land, miles from help, off a country road where screams die in the wind.
Victims were lured to an isolated area with the expectation of reuniting with the children. There is no evidence the children were ever brought to the site.
4 adults were waiting in ambush. Tiffany Adams, Paul Grice, Tad Cullum, Cole Twombly. According to arrest documents, they had prepared for war. Stun guns charged and ready, prepaid phones to stay off the grid. And a trench already carved into the pasture. Fresh dirt, waiting to be filled. The attack was swift, merciless. Medical examiners cataloged the horror. Defensive wounds where they tried to fight back. Multiple sharp force injuries that ended their struggles. Both women were stunned with electricity first. Then came the blades. Veralyn, likely the first to die. Janae, probably running when they caught her. One suspect later confessed to holding them down. Another admitted to watching it happen. And Paul Grice, he helped bury them into the earth. 4 people, 2 victims, 1 coordinated execution.
What's chilling is the ritualized calm of it. This wasn't a panic kill. This was calculated. Everyone had a role. That's what makes group murders so dangerous. Shared belief reduces personal guilt.
The group had rehearsed this moment, not with practice runs, but with years of poisonous ideology. They believed Veralyn had shattered divine law by demanding her children back. They believed Janae was aiding her rebellion against God's order. So they erased them both, clean, final, holy. They dragged the bodies to a nearby pasture, land that one of the suspects knew like the back of their hand, where he dug a trench days earlier, telling anyone who had asked it was for a storm shelter. Instead, it became a tomb. 2 women buried, covered with Oklahoma dirt, marked by nothing but silence and prairie grass, as if they'd never existed at all.
The nature of the burial and how the bodies were positioned suggests the crime was not spontaneous. There was a deliberate plan.
The women's phones were smashed into pieces, their car abandoned where it sat. Their families checking messages that would never come, waiting for calls that would never ring. 2 lives erased as if they'd simply vanished into thin air. It took nearly 2 weeks. Search teams following digital breadcrumbs, phone pings, tire impressions, witness interviews that slowly pieced together the truth. One clue led to another until they returned to the remote pasture. April 14th. Law enforcement broke ground and found them. Janae, Verlin, still in their clothes, still wearing the hope that they'd be going home that day, still believing they were just picking up children.
We were hoping we'd find them alive, but the moment we stepped onto that property, it just felt wrong. Too quiet, too empty.
The next day, the handcuffs came out. One by one, they fell. Each suspect dragged from the very community they claimed to be saving. Protectors turned to predators. Neighbors turned to killers. We imagine evil with a megaphone and a manifesto. Something that shouts from rooftops, marches in formation, flaunts its darkness. But sometimes evil drives a rusted pickup, waves at your kids in the grocery store, reads scriptures on Sunday and digs graves on Monday. This wasn't just murder. This was ideology with blood on its hands. This was enforcement disguised as righteousness. This was a system that whispered, "We know better than the law. We are the law."
I still check my phone sometimes, like maybe she'll text, like it was all some nightmare and I'll wake up. But she's gone. They took her.
What happened in that pasture wasn't a crime of passion. It was calculated terror wrapped in divine justification. Cold-blooded execution in the name of something they called God. But no God worth worshiping demands innocent blood. No holy book orders the murder of mothers. This was just evil wearing a cross. Now we step inside the courtroom where justice meets delusion. When twisted faith meets the law. How prosecutors try to convict ideology, how defense lawyers spin delusion into doubt, and how families fight for justice when the killers claim God told them to do it. There's the justice we dream about, the justice we see in movies. And then there's the messy, imperfect justice we actually get. In Texas County, Oklahoma, 4 people stood trial for double murder. Their weapons weren't just knives and stun guns. They had something more dangerous. Absolute conviction. And conviction doesn't always translate neatly into a courtroom. April 2024. 4 defendants, 4 sets of handcuffs, 4 lives destroyed by their own choices. The charges? 2 counts of first-degree murder, kidnapping, criminal conspiracy. The state's case was brutal in its simplicity. Tiffany Adams, Paul Grice, Tad Coulomb, and Cole Twombly had executed Verlin Vasquez and Janae Strobel in cold blood, all in service of an extremist faith that they called murder holy.
This was not a crime of passion. It was a coordinated, ideologically driven execution intended to eliminate what they viewed as moral enemies.
The prosecution built their case on one devastating truth: intent. The suspects didn't just plan the murders. They believed they were righteous to commit them. To prove it, they unleashed a flood of evidence. Text messages mapping out the plan, weapon purchases in the days before, a confession that unraveled everything. and journal entries from the group calling themselves God's misfits, ideology written in their own hand, justifying murder as divine will. The defense couldn't deny the blood. Instead, they rewrote the story around it. Tiffany Adams' attorney painted her as a concerned grandmother, desperate to protect her grandchildren from an unstable mother. Paul Grice's lawyer claimed manipulation, that he'd been swept up in groupthink and coercion. Brainwashed, one reporter called it. Not killers, just victims of their own twisted faith.
Mr. Grice did not act alone. He was not the mastermind. He was a follower who made terrible decisions under psychological and emotional pressure.
Order in the courtroom. The courtroom became a battleground of competing truths. Justice versus divine authority. Criminal motive versus spiritual mission. And at the center of it all, 2 dead women who couldn't speak for themselves, and a community still bleeding from the wound. The trial morphed into something bigger than murder charges. It became a referendum on faith itself. Witnesses testified that the defendants had branded the court system satanic, that they believed Verlin had cursed her bloodline by demanding her children back, that Janae was marked for death simply for standing beside her friend. This wasn't just a criminal trial. This was theology on trial, divine delusion versus human law, a showdown between twisted faith and earthly justice.
I'm a cult deprogrammer, and what I see in cases like these is, well, they weren't simply anti-government. They believed they were divinely authorized. That's what makes these cases so dangerous. Logic doesn't penetrate divine conviction.
And yet the system still clung to reason. Still tried to weigh facts like they mattered more than prophecy. Still told the jury, this is murder, no matter what voice you heard in your head. No matter what your God whispered in the dark. June 17th, 2024. The verdict dropped like a hammer. Paul Grice, guilty on all counts. No escape. Tiffany Adams, guilty of conspiracy, kidnapping, and accessory to murder. The grandmother who chose blood over mercy. Tad Cullum, trial delayed. New evidence surfaced at the last minute. Cole Twombly, severed trial. Mental competency in question. Inside the courtroom, silence hung heavy as death. Outside, the air crackled like something louder than words.
It's not justice, it's the best we're gonna get, but nothing brings them back. Nothing brings back these girls. We lost them to these evil, twisted people using God to justify their evil ways. It's sick.
And maybe that's the hardest truth of all. Justice, at its best, deals in facts and evidence, clean lines, clear verdicts. But grief lives in the space between, where belief and pain tangle together in something no verdict can untangle. The trials are still grinding forward. Cullum and Trombley still waiting for their day in court. This quiet spread of extremist poison and its dangerous ideologies take root in forgotten communities. What red flags keep being missed? This Oklahoma tragedy is just one chapter in a much larger American story. But something bigger is stirring in the aftermath. People are asking how this poison spread so quietly, why no one saw the signs, why no one stepped in before blood was spilled. And those are the questions no courtroom can answer. Those are the questions that haunt long after the gavel falls.
The warning signs were there. People just didn't want to believe it could happen here, but it can, and it did.
You probably think you'd know. If your neighbor was planning murder, if the person who bags your groceries or sits in your church pew was radicalized. But here's the uncomfortable truth. You wouldn't. Because extremism today doesn't always come with manifestos and marches. It's not always organized into militias and matching uniforms. Sometimes it's just a quiet belief system, festering in plain sight. One that no one ever thinks to question. It's not just Texas County, Oklahoma. Since 2015, law enforcement has tracked a chilling trend. Rural extremist networks mixing religion, politics, and conspiracy into something deadly. Washington State, a self-declared prophet turned his compound into a fortress. Michigan, a man gunned down his own family, convinced they were reptilian agents. Missouri, a father slaughtered his wife and child to purify his bloodline. And here, in Oklahoma, 4 people committed double murder and called it divine obedience. This pattern is spreading like wildfire across forgotten America.
I have studied extremism for years. This isn't about organized terrorism in the way we used to think about it. It's about radicalization through isolation. People out in the country online 8 hours a day, stewing in conspiracies with no counterpoint. They refuse to believe anything that doesn't live in their echo chamber.
Step 1. Distrust festers. Courts become corrupt. Religious indoctrination occurs. Law enforcement becomes the enemy. Step 2. The vacuum fills with poison. Social media influencers feeding paranoia. Step 3. A new order emerges. Divine hierarchy, patriarchal control, apocalyptic urgency, militaristic righteousness. Step 4. Action. Sometimes that action is yelling at school board meetings. Sometimes it's digging graves in Oklahoma dirt.
As an FBI profiler, what I see is these people don't think they're doing something bad. They think they're heroes in a war. And if you challenge that, you're the enemy.
The danger isn't just in the twisted ideas themselves. It's in how normal they become. Tiffany Adams sang hymns on Sunday morning. Paul Grice fixed your broken air conditioner with a smile. They weren't hiding in bunkers or wearing masks. They were waving at neighbors in the grocery store, then going home to plan murder. Evil, wearing the mask of ordinary. The data doesn't lie. Women, children, and the LGBTQ people bear the brunt of ideology-driven violence. In Verlin Vance's case, her crime was escape. She challenged male authority. She dared to want her children back. In communities where divine patriarchy hides behind family values, that makes you a target. That makes you expendable. That makes you worthy of death.
We hear stories all the time. Women who can't leave because the church says submit, who fear their ex not just because he's abusive, but because he thinks God's on his side.
Ideological extremism doesn't always come with camouflage and assault rifles. Sometimes it wears a friendly smile. Sometimes it sits in the church pew behind you, singing along the hymns. And its most frequent victims? The ones who dare to live freely, the ones who refuse to stay in line. So what do we do with this knowledge? We reached out to former law enforcement, digital misinformation researchers, and deprogrammers who've seen this poison up close. Here's what they told us. Listen for the language: natural law, sovereign citizen, deep state, bloodlines, God's law. These aren't just buzzwords, they're warning signs. Don't dismiss the red flags. Sudden behavior changes, threats wrapped in divine language, isolation from friends and family. Challenge the myth that it's inevitable. Create space for different stories in churches, classrooms, and online forums. Counter narratives that don't leave people drowning in paranoia.
We need to talk about these things before the bodies show up. The barbecues, the town halls, the Friday night football games. Those are chances to reach people before it's too late.
Because here's the most terrifying truth of all. Most people who radicalize into violence didn't begin as monsters. They started lonely, angry, disconnected from the world around them. And someone filled that emptiness with purpose, with righteousness wrapped in divine language, with a target to blame for all their pain. Extremism doesn't always announce itself with manifestos and military gear. Sometimes it wears a friendly smile. Sometimes it sits beside you during Sunday service. Sometimes it lives next door, mowing the lawn and waving hello. The question isn't if it's out there. The question is whether we're brave enough to see it. Whether we're willing to look past the ordinary mask and recognize the monster underneath. We will close out this story with the reckoning. Where do the families go from here? What happens to the children caught in the crossfire? And what does justice even look like when faith itself has been turned into a weapon? When God's name has been used to justify the unforgivable? What remains after the gavel falls? The grief that never heals. The trauma that spreads like wildfire. The small town fractures that may never mend. And the haunting certainty that somewhere else, another trench is being dug. The trials are winding down. The media circus has left town. the reporters have moved on to the next tragedy. But for the people left behind, the nightmare continues. Children still wake up calling for a mother who will never answer. The town still whispers about that family in grocery store aisles, and no one, not really, knows how to heal from this. When the verdict came down, there were tears, but no relief, no closure. Tiffany Adams and Paul Grice were found guilty. Justice served, the headline said. Tad Cullum and Cole Twombly still wait for their turn in court. But Verlin Vasquez and Janae Strobel are still buried in Oklahoma soil. No sentence can resurrect the dead.
I don't think I even heard the word guilty. I was looking at her chair, the one she should have been sitting in. I just kept thinking, she should be here.
That's the thing about justice. It's procedural, clinical, cold as courtroom marble. It rarely feels like enough. It never feels like enough. Verlin had 2 children. At the time of her murder, she was fighting to bring them home. Now they're in the care of a guardian whose name stays hidden for safety. But trauma this deep doesn't stay buried. It lives in bedtime stories that end too soon. In family trees with blank spaces where a mother should be. In questions that have no good answers.
As a child trauma counselor, I can tell you, children who lose a parent to violence, especially by someone the family knew, are at high risk for anxiety, PTSD, and emotional regression. The grief hits in waves, sometimes years later.
We wondered if the truth would ever reach them. The response, it will. In time, because someday they'll search for her online, and this podcast could be their discovery. This small town in Texas County, Oklahoma, like many small communities, refuses to let this tragedy define them. But the truth demands to be heard. We interviewed a local pastor familiar with the family.
People are scared. They're asking questions we don't have answers for. They wonder if they should have said something earlier. Some blame themselves.
But remorse alone won't repair what's broken. Only deliberate action can reshape what's ahead. Community members have begun mobilizing. Reading groups, wellness gatherings, even forums exploring extremism and belief. Modest efforts, but progress all the same. We contacted Oklahoma Child Protective Services, police, and the prosecutor's office. Several refused to speak on the matter. Others never returned our calls. One official spoke anonymously.
We were overwhelmed. We missed it. The signs were there, but so were 100 other emergencies.
This is where the system breaks down. Not through conspiracy, but through exhaustion. Groups like God's Misfits exploit exactly this. They don't require corrupt officials, just overwhelmed ones. We hope this would provide closure, but honestly, there isn't much to offer. The victims remain gone. The children are still in pain. And the ideology that drove this killing, it's still out there. God's Misfits isn't monitored by authorities. They weren't broadcasting or collecting donations. They simply held beliefs that were unchecked. Until tragedy struck.
We keep thinking extremism wears camouflage, but more often it wears denim, drives a pickup, sits next to you in church. The reckoning comes when we stop seeing that as impossible.
We shared this story because Verlin and Janae deserve more than a news brief. Because staying quiet enables the violence. And because perhaps, if we expose the warning signs, we can prevent the next tragedy. If this case reminded you of someone in your life, speak up. If it disturbed you, it should. If it made you reconsider dismissing extreme views, that's progress. Because radicalization doesn't happen overnight. It's a gradual poison. This was Buried in God's Country. We'll be back. New stories. Same purpose. Truth is louder when we listen. I'm Dan Cooley. Stay alert. Stay safe. This has been File 187. Written and produced by Joe McReynolds. Narration by Dan Cooley.